The greatest treasure carried on ancient trade routes was not silk or gold, but the stories whispered between merchants. Long before the internet, these narratives were a secret currency that connected the world. This journey reveals how ancient storytellers transformed simple paths of commerce into legendary highways of myth. You will discover the hidden psychological mechanisms that made these tales so powerful and enduring. We will untangle how a story from India could find a home in Rome, and why a monster described in China might appear on a map in Greece. What forgotten tale from your own culture might have traveled thousands of miles to reach you? Picture the scene as the sun sets over a desert oasis. A campfire crackles, its light dancing on the faces of merchants from distant lands. They have spent the day trading spices and silks, but now, as the cool night air settles, they trade something far more enduring. They exchange stories. This was the true dawn of narrative commerce, a time when tales were a form of cultural currency as valuable as any spice or gem. The ancient incense route, winding through the Arabian Peninsula, did not just carry frankincense and myrrh, it carried the legends that gave these precious resins their soul. A trader would not simply sell a bundle of frankincense, he would share the myth of the phoenix, the sacred bird that built its funeral pyre from these very aromatic woods, its smoke carrying prayers to the heavens. That story transformed a commodity into a key to the divine, multiplying its worth immeasurably. Historians like Peter Frankopan point out that this was a brilliant, practical business strategy. A good story built a bridge of shared wonder between people who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods. It created common ground, fostering the trust necessary for deals to be made and partnerships to form. In this way, a merchant from Mesopotamia and a trader from the Nile Delta, once strangers, could become allies through a shared tale. Our ancestors, it seems, understood the psychology of value long before modern marketing was even a concept. They knew that we, as humans, are not just purchasing an object. We are buying the meaning woven into it. We are investing in the legend. This ancient impulse to infuse our journeys and our transactions with narrative is a thread that connects us directly to those long-ago campfires. These merchant bards were the original masters of persuasion, their words as carefully crafted as the goods they carried. Think of a Phoenician sailor, his hands stained with the prized purple dye, not just presenting a color but reciting an epic poem of the sea god's wrath and the monstrous creatures that guarded the deep. The dye itself became a character in the story, a treasure wrested from the jaws of the abyss. This was not merely entertainment, it was a sophisticated business strategy. These individuals functioned as living libraries, their memories vast storehouses of genealogies, trade routes, and geographical lore. A single voyage required them to be navigators, negotiators, and performers all at once. A simple account of a large fish, something we might call a whale, would be masterfully reshaped into a terrifying encounter with a leviathan, a beast with scales like shields and a roar that silenced the waves. This exaggeration was not deceit, but a form of value creation, transforming a mundane observation into a legendary experience that buyers could carry home with their purchase. Their true genius, however, lay in their adaptability. A story told in an Egyptian port about a river spirit might be cleverly reframed in a Greek marketplace to feature a local nymph. The core wonder remained, but the cultural wrapping changed to build a bridge of familiarity. These merchant bards were the original influencers, their narratives directly shaping the desirability of exotic goods. A well-told tale could secure a lifelong trading partner, while a clumsy one could close a port forever. Their ancient legacy reminds us that understanding your audience and adapting your message is not a new concept. It is a timeless art, first perfected on the rocking decks of ships and in the bustling markets of the ancient world, where the right story could turn a simple trader into a legend. While the merchant bards shaped stories for profit, another voice carried tales for a different purpose entirely. Along the same dusty trails walked the Pilgrim Scribe, a traveler whose quest was spiritual, but whose path was paved by commerce. These were often monks and scholars, their journeys funded by the very trade networks they documented, moving in the protective shadow of merchant caravans. Their primary mission was sacred, to collect scriptures or reach a holy site, yet they became accidental archivists of the world's mythology. A Buddhist monk from China, like the famed Xuanzang, would walk for years, and at every oasis and caravanserai he would listen. He recorded not just the precise Buddhist doctrines, but also the local tales of mountain gods, river spirits, and miraculous events whispered by the people he met. His travelogue, therefore, became a unique tapestry, weaving together high philosophy with the vibrant folklore of the common people. These accounts carried a powerful aura of authenticity. When a pilgrim scribe wrote of a miracle, it was presented not as a merchant's told tale, but as a documented event within a spiritual journey. This added a layer of profound weight to the stories already circulating on the trade route. A legend about a protective deity in a narrow mountain pass, once just a traveler's story, gained new credibility when a respected monk attested to feeling its presence during his own perilous crossing. The Pilgrim Scribe reframed the entire landscape of commerce. A dangerous stretch of road was not merely a hazard to be endured, it was a trial of faith. A successful trade was not just good luck, but perhaps a blessing from a local spirit. They placed the mundane, risky business of buying and selling within a vast, cosmic narrative of destiny and divine will. This connection between the search for profit and the search for meaning was seamless. A merchant might donate to a monk's journey, gaining spiritual merit while also gaining access to the scribe's meticulously recorded maps and knowledge of safe passages. The scribe, in turn, received the protection and resources needed to complete his sacred task. Their legacy shows us that the human drive for material wealth and the yearning for spiritual understanding have never been separate. They have always traveled together, each giving the other purpose, transforming the simple act of journeying into a pilgrimage and turning every traded item into a potential vessel for grace. The Silk Road was a web of woven words, a vast network where the most precious cargo was often intangible. Think of it not as one road, but as 1,000 threads of narrative crisscrossing continents, each carrying a piece of a culture's soul. A story that began in a Chinese marketplace could, over generations, find a new voice in a Persian court, its meaning subtly shifting with every telling. The Chinese dragon, for instance, was not originally a beast of malice. It was a benevolent symbol of power and reign, a creature of the heavens. But as tales of this magnificent serpent traveled west, they encountered different fears and legends. These stories blended with local lore of giant serpents and beasts of chaos, slowly transforming the Eastern dragon into the fire-breathing antagonist of Western mythology. The story itself was a living thing, adapting to its new environment just to survive. This constant, fluid exchange is perfectly captured in the journey of the Buddhist Jataka tales. These were moral fables about the Buddha's previous lives, often as an animal or a common person. As merchants and monks carried these stories out of India and into the oasis towns of Central Asia, something remarkable happened. Local storytellers did not simply recite them, they reinvented them. A tale about a selfless deer might be reset in a nearby mountain range the audience knew, and the heroic king in the story might begin to sound like a beloved local chieftain. The core lesson of compassion remained, but the cultural clothing changed, making the foreign wisdom feel intimately local and true. This was a highway of hybrid myths. Zoroastrian ideas of a cosmic struggle between light and darkness drifted east, possibly influencing depictions of duality. Greek legends, left behind in the wake of Alexander the Great's campaigns, were picked up and woven into the grand tapestries of Indian epics. The world, for the first time on such a scale, was becoming narratively interconnected. A single story could have a Greek hero, an Indian setting, and a Central Asian moral, proving that a myth's true home is not a place on a map, but the human heart that understands it. This ancient process shows us that globalization is not a product of the internet or jet planes. It is a story as old as trade itself. The goods that moved along those routes, the silks and spices, have long since turned to dust. But the stories they carried, the ones that were endlessly remade and retold, those are the true legacy of the Silk Road. They remind us that our identities are not fixed, but are constantly being woven from the countless threads of narrative that have reached us across the centuries. The scent of cinnamon on the air was more than just a promise of flavor. It was an invitation to a legend. These spices, arriving from lands so distant they seemed like fantasies, carried with them an entire mythology designed to explain their very existence. To justify their immense cost and rarity, merchants and sailors spun tales of impossible origins and mythical guardians. They spoke of the cinnamon bird, a great phoenix-like creature that built its nests from the precious bark high on unreachable cliffs. The only way to collect the spice, the story went, was to trick the bird into knocking the nests down with heavy weights, a narrative that framed every bundle of cinnamon as a prize won through cleverness and daring. Similarly, pepper was said to be guarded by fierce serpents, its groves protected by creatures of myth. These were not simple lies, they were strategic narratives that transformed a business transaction into a heroic quest. The aura of danger and wonder these stories created was a powerful motivator, encouraging merchants to undertake perilous voyages and investors to fund them. They were selling an adventure, not just a seasoning. This was perhaps one of the earliest and most effective forms of branding. A region became synonymous not just with a product, but with a magical property. The tales attached to a specific spice created a perception of superior quality and authenticity that competitors could not easily match. When you bought pepper from a particular merchant, you were not just buying heat for your food, you were buying a piece of a dragon's treasure. This deep-seated human impulse to weave legends around that which is rare and desirable reveals a fundamental truth about value. Our desire is often shaped not by the object itself, but by the story we believe about it. That ancient psychological mechanism, first perfected on the spice routes, is the very same force that drives modern consumer culture today, reminding us that we have always been captivated more by the myth than the material. That golden glow in a piece of amber feels like holding a piece of time itself. Along the ancient amber road, stretching from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea to the warm markets of the Mediterranean, this fossilized resin was far more than a beautiful trinket. It was a vessel for entire worlds of myth. In the north, storytellers whispered that these golden stones were the tears of a goddess wept for her lost husband. Others saw them as fragments of the sun fallen to earth after a great celestial battle. These were not just pretty tales, they were the soul of the material, a narrative identity that traveled south with every piece of amber carried by traders. When these golden nuggets reached the Greco-Roman world, their stories evolved to resonate with a new audience. Southern cultures adopted the northern legend, but reframed it through their own cosmic drama, linking amber to the tragic myth of Phaethon, the son of the sun god who crashed his father's chariot. They said the amber was the hardened tears of his grieving sisters, or bits of the sun itself scattered across the earth. A trader from the Baltic would not simply sell a piece of amber, he would offer a piece of a fallen star, a solidified tear of a goddess, a tangible piece of a divine story. This narrative alchemy transformed the object. It was no longer just jewelry, it was a protective amulet, a connection to the heavens, a symbol of eternal light triumphing over darkness. The value of the amber was inextricably linked to the power of its story. This exchange along the Amber Road demonstrates a profound economic truth, that a natural resources narrative could be its most valuable export. The story itself became a commodity, carefully packaged and transported alongside the physical material. A culture that believed amber held protective powers would pay far more for a piece accompanied by its legendary origin. This process turned a simple object into a symbol of belief and identity, allowing someone in Rome to wear a pendant and feel connected to the myths of a northern goddess or the power of the sun. The Amber Road teaches us that the stories we choose to tell about the objects we value do not just describe them, they define their very essence in the human imagination, a lesson that echoes from those ancient forest paths to our modern marketplaces today. A serpent of camels and men slithered across an ocean of sand, their journey measured not in miles but in the slow turn of stars overhead. In the profound silence of the Sahara night, with the desert cold settling around them, the only warmth often came from the voices of the Griots. These were not mere travelers, they were the living libraries of West Africa, the master historians and poets who walked alongside the gold and salt. Their memories held the genealogies of kings, the laws of empires, and the epic tales that gave a people their identity. A single griot could recite the history of the Mali Empire for generations, his voice a bridge connecting the present to a legendary past. The stories they shared under that immense sky were far more than entertainment to pass the hours. They were the very fabric of society. The Epic of Sundiata, for instance, which tells of the founding of the Mali Empire, was not just a thrilling story of a hero overcoming hardship. It was a legal document establishing the right of a dynasty to rule. It was a moral guide illustrating the values of justice and resilience. It was a source of political legitimacy, so powerful that a ruler's authority was reinforced every time the epic was performed. These narratives were the invisible cargo that gave meaning to the material wealth being transported. The gold dust carried north was not just a precious metal, it was the legacy of Sundiata himself. The salt blocks carried south were not just a mineral for survival, they were the substance of the stories traded for them. The griot's role was essential for survival in a world of such vast distances and diverse cultures. His stories created a shared understanding, a common cultural ground that allowed the merchants of the Sahel and the traders of North Africa to see each other not as foreigners, but as partners in a grand human endeavor. He transformed the terrifying emptiness of the desert into a landscape filled with meaning, where every dune might hold the echo of an ancestor's words, and every oasis was a chapter in a continuing saga. This oral tradition was an act of incredible resilience. In a place where written parchments could be lost to sand or time, the stories were kept safe in the human heart, passed from one generation to the next with meticulous care. The legacy of the Griots is a profound testament to the power of the spoken word to maintain cultural continuity against all odds, binding continents together not with roads, but with rhythm, memory, and the timeless human need to tell our story beneath the watching stars. The creaking timbers of a Greek trireme carried more than just warriors, they carried the very blueprint of the Mediterranean's imagination. As these ships traced the same routes used by earlier Minoan and Phoenician traders, their crews did not just navigate by the stars, they navigated by story. The epic tales of Odysseus, lost for years on his voyage home, were not pure fiction. They were a layered mythology built upon generations of very real maritime experience. A sailor's account of a volcanic eruption near Sicily, with its thunderous roar and towering plume of black smoke, could easily become the towering, one-eyed Cyclops hurling boulders in a blind rage. The strange, hypnotic calls of seals echoing from a rocky cove might transform into the deadly song of the sirens, luring ships onto the sharp teeth of the shore. Every strange culture encountered, every unexplainable natural wonder, was filtered through a familiar cosmological lens, giving the unknown a name and a shape that a crew could understand and fear. These myths were far more than simple explanations. They were a sophisticated, oral system of navigation and risk management. A story about a many-headed sea monster devouring ships at a specific coastal inlet was not just a thrilling campfire tale. It was a vital warning about a treacherous whirlpool or a shoreline inhabited by a hostile community. The legend of the lost city of Atlantis, first described by Plato, may well have been a dramatic retelling of the catastrophic volcanic eruption that devastated the Minoan civilization on Thera. The story encoded a real historical disaster, serving as a permanent, memorable lesson about the raw power of the sea and the earth. In an age before detailed charts, these narratives became living maps. A bard singing of Odysseus clinging to the wreck of his ship conveyed the very real dangers of a sudden Mediterranean squall, embedding practical survival knowledge within a framework of heroic endurance. This shared body of story created a common language for everyone who sailed the inland sea. A Phoenician merchant and a Greek sailor, though they might not speak the same tongue, would both understand the peril symbolized by a tale of a multi-headed hydra. This mythological vocabulary allowed for the rapid exchange of crucial information across cultures, fostering a unique maritime identity that transcended political borders. The story of a voyage became a collective possession, constantly refined and adapted with each new telling. A Minoan trading post might add a detail to a legend, which a Phoenician ship would then carry to North Africa, where it would be woven into local lore before finally reaching a Greek port. The Mediterranean was not just a body of water connecting cities, it was a circulatory system for narrative, where every wave seemed to whisper a piece of a larger, eternal story. These maritime myths remind us that some of our oldest stories were born from necessity, a way to make the vast and terrifying sea feel just a little smaller and a little more known for those who dared to venture upon it. The roar of the marketplace was a symphony of human connection. In the great agora of Athens or the sprawling forum of Rome, the air was thick with more than the smells of spices and cooking food. It was charged with the energy of 1,000 converging stories. This was the internet of the ancient world, a physical hub where narratives from the farthest reaches of the known earth collided and merged. A merchant just arrived from the ports of India might gather a crowd, not by displaying his silks, but by sharing a simple parable about a monkey and a crocodile. A few stalls away, an Egyptian priest far from home might find himself explaining the intricate myth of Osiris and the afterlife to a curious Celtic trader, his words translated through a chain of interpreters. In these vibrant, chaotic spaces, a story was only as valuable as its ability to captivate a diverse and often skeptical audience. This environment forced a constant, creative reinterpretation. A tale about a river spirit from Mesopotamia, told in the Roman Forum, might quickly adopt the name and attributes of a local river god to make its meaning clear and its impact immediate. The marketplace was a live testing ground for narrative where the most resonant stories survived and spread, while the clumsy ones faded into the background noise. This was not a slow, scholarly process. It was a dynamic public performance. A storyteller adapted his tale in real time, watching the faces of his listeners, emphasizing the parts that drew gasps or laughter, and trimming the elements that caused confusion or disinterest. The most successful narratives, the ones that went viral in the ancient sense, were those that found a universal human chord, a theme of love, betrayal, ingenuity, or loss that transcended any single culture. These spaces became engines of cultural innovation precisely because they were centers of commerce. The same economic forces that brought a Persian carpet to Rome also brought the legend woven into its pattern. The pursuit of profit created an accidental and incredibly efficient system for distributing the collective imagination of humanity. A shopper might leave the forum with a new cooking pot, but also with a strange and wonderful story about a phoenix reborn from ashes, a tale that would be retold that evening at home, subtly altering the local understanding of the world. The legacy of these ancient marketplaces reminds us that stories have always flourished at the crossroads, in the bustling, unpredictable places where different people and their ideas are forced to meet, mingle, and create something entirely new together. A story about a clever trickster god did not simply travel from West Africa to the Caribbean. It was reborn. The core spirit of the narrative, the archetype of a cunning underdog using wit to overcome stronger forces, remained powerfully intact. But the name of the god changed, and his adventures were reset within a new world. The spider Anansi of Akan folklore, a beloved figure who often outsmarted larger animals, found a new voice in the Caribbean. There he continued his clever antics, but now within a landscape of sugarcane fields and colonial plantations, his stories becoming subtle lessons in resilience and intellectual resistance for displaced communities. This was not a loss of the original tale, but a profound act of creative preservation. The localizing of a myth was essential for its survival. A story about a river spirit from the Niger would hold little immediate meaning for someone living in the swamps of South Carolina. But if that spirit was reinterpreted as a local water entity with a similar personality, the story could take root, its central message about respecting nature suddenly becoming directly relevant to the listener's own environment. The specific cultural wrapping was adaptable, but the universal human truth inside the package was timeless. This process reveals a beautiful dialogue between cultures, facilitated by the movement of people and goods. A version of a flood myth found in Mesopotamia might share a striking structural similarity with one from indigenous American traditions, not because one copied the other, but because both were grappling with the same fundamental human experiences of catastrophe and renewal. Trade routes did not just move stories, they provided a framework for this endless creative remixing. They allowed a community to encounter a foreign narrative and see not just its strangeness, but its underlying, relatable heart. They could then clothe that heart in the familiar garments of their own gods, their own landscapes, and their own histories. This is how mythology became a truly global tapestry, woven from countless local threads. Every time a story was retold in a new land, it was not a copy being made, but a new original being born, proof that the most enduring human truths are those flexible enough to find a home anywhere. A sailor steering by the stars was doing more than just finding his way. He was activating a living map, one written in epic poetry and celestial legend. The constellation Orion was not merely a pattern of bright lights. It was the great hunter, and his position in the sky told a story that included the arrival of seasonal winds vital for a safe voyage. This was the profound utility of myth, a sophisticated system for encoding practical knowledge within unforgettable narratives. A story about a river god who grew angry and spilled over his banks was, in truth, a community's collective memory of annual flood patterns, a vital piece of agricultural planning preserved as drama. Tales of a temperamental mountain deity who hurled white stones down his slopes were clear, memorable warnings about avalanche risks for anyone attempting a crossing. These myths transformed an abstract, often perilous landscape into a place with personality and intention, making the wilderness feel knowable and less terrifying. The world itself became a story you had to learn to read to survive. This reveals a deep, pre-scientific wisdom, an understanding that the most important lessons about the environment are best remembered when they are felt, not just memorized. Our ancestors saw no separation between the practical need to navigate a mountain pass and the poetic tale of the spirit who guarded it. For them, knowledge was a single, woven tapestry. The hard data of geography and astronomy were the threads, but the myth was the beautiful, durable pattern that held everything together and made it memorable. This holistic view of the world, where every natural feature had a story and every story had a purpose, is a form of intelligence we are only now beginning to appreciate again, as we search for ways to reconnect a profound understanding of our place in the world with the data that defines it. That ordinary rug, woven from common wool, could command the price of a small fortune if the merchant knew the right words to say. He would run his hands over the fabric and speak of desert spirits who guided the weaver's hands under the light of a full moon, infusing the cloth with their protection for any traveler who carried it. This was not a simple lie, it was a calculated act of economic alchemy. The story itself created a powerful perceived scarcity. If only a select few artisans were blessed by these spirits, then the supply of such rugs was inherently limited and their value soared accordingly. This narrative justified a premium price far beyond the cost of the materials and labor, transforming a basic commodity into a rare, mystical artifact. The most successful merchants and trade cities mastered this art, building what we would now call brand loyalty that could last for centuries. The legendary Tyrian purple dye, for instance, was not famous merely for its vibrant color that did not fade. Its astronomical cost was sustained by a rich mythology that linked its origin to the gods and its production to a secret, sacred process known only to a chosen few. Similarly, Chinese silk was shrouded in tales of its own divine origins and mythical guardians, stories so effective that for a long time, the Romans believed the fabric grew on trees. These narratives were not decorative additions to the sales pitch, they were the very engine of the product's economic success. They created an unbreakable link in the buyer's mind between the physical object and a profound, intangible value. This ancient practice established the foundational principles of modern brand storytelling, where the worth of an item is inextricably tied to the meaning we attach to it. A purchase becomes more than a transaction. It becomes an entry point into a legend, a way to own a piece of a story that resonates with our deepest desires for identity, protection, or status. This reveals a timeless truth about market dynamics, that belief and imagination have always been powerful, tangible forces in commerce, capable of transforming the value of an object long before the first coin ever changes hands. The wax that sealed Icarus's fate was more than a poetic device. It was a critical variable in an ancient thought experiment about lift and material failure. The myth of Daedalus and Icarus, often reduced to a simple lesson about ambition, functions on a deeper level as a preserved record of early aerodynamic observation. The choice of feathers, the construction of the wing's frame, the specific warning against flying too close to the sun or the sea, each element encodes a practical understanding of weight, thermal limits, and atmospheric density. This was not a manual for building a flying machine, but a narrative vessel for carrying the very principles of flight across generations in a memorable, cautionary package. This pattern of embedding technical knowledge within epic tales was a common and brilliant practice. The Greek god Hephaestus, the limping divine blacksmith, is a walking allegory for the metallurgical process. His forge burns with a divine, unquenchable fire, a metaphor for the sustained, high temperatures needed to work iron. His act of crafting automatons and intricate traps translates the abstract skills of engineering and robotics into a divine drama. Similarly, the Norse dwarves Brokkr and Iri were not just magical beings. Their legendary creation of Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, with its perfectly balanced head and short handle, encapsulates generations of accumulated knowledge about smithing, alloy composition, and the physics of a weapon's swing. These stories did more than entertain, they protected vital trade secrets. A family of stonemasons might have a foundational myth about a hero who learned the secret of cutting granite from a mountain spirit. The story, told to apprentices, would contain veiled instructions about using wet wedges to split stone, or the best time of year to quarry, all disguised as the hero's trials. This narrative method ensured that the core of the knowledge survived, even if the specific individuals or written records were lost. It was a form of intellectual copyright, written not on parchment, but in the collective memory of a community, safeguarding the specialized skills that guaranteed a guild's economic survival and cultural prestige. This reveals a sophisticated, pre-literate form of pedagogy, one that recognized that the human mind clings to a story long after it has forgotten a list of instructions. By wrapping complex technological concepts in the compelling cloak of character, conflict, and consequence, our ancestors ensured that the most valuable discoveries of their age would not merely be remembered, but would truly take flight. This blending of faiths was not a weakening of belief, but a strengthening of connection. In the bustling caravan city of Palmyra, a merchant might begin his day with an offering to the Mesopotamian god Bel, then seek the favor of the Greek Zeus before a journey, and finally pay respects to the local Arab deity Al-Lat, seeing each as a different facet of a single protective divine power. For this individual, there was no contradiction, only a practical and spiritual toolkit assembled from the stories flowing into his city from every direction. His identity was not rooted in a single, pure tradition, but was a cosmopolitan tapestry woven from the many threads of narrative he encountered. This syncretic mindset was the natural result of life at a crossroads, where the daily necessity of commerce demanded an open and adaptable worldview. The Hellenistic world is a perfect example where, after Alexander's conquests, Greek settlers living in Egypt and the Near East did not simply impose their own gods. Instead, they found common ground, merging their Zeus with the Egyptian Ammon to create Zeus Ammon, and their Aphrodite with the Mesopotamian Ishtar. These hybrid deities were more than diplomatic gestures. They were the divine representation of a new, interconnected identity that was essential for trade and cooperation. A similar fusion occurred along the maritime routes to Southeast Asia. Hindu and Buddhist myths carried by Indian traders and priests did not erase the local animist beliefs of the region. Instead, they blended with them. A local mountain spirit might be reinterpreted as a manifestation of Shiva, or a forest guardian might be seen as a protective bodhisattva. This created a rich, layered spiritual landscape where the foreign and the familiar coexisted and reinforced one another. What emerged from these narrative melting pots was a new kind of person, one whose sense of self was not rigidly tied to a single ethnicity or a single story of origin. This cosmopolitan identity was inherently flexible, allowing an individual to communicate and build trust with people from vastly different backgrounds. It was an identity built on shared stories rather than shared bloodlines, proving that our capacity for cultural synthesis is one of humanity's greatest strengths. In these ancient hubs, the story was the true citizen, and everyone who understood it belonged. Yet for all their power to connect, these ancient stories also knew how to build walls. The same campfire that hosted tales of wonder could also whisper chilling warnings of the void that lay just beyond the known world. Storytellers did not just describe monsters, they strategically placed them on the mental maps of their listeners. The Greek Gorgons, with their serpent hair and petrifying gaze, were not merely mythical creatures. Their legend was often situated at the very edge of navigable waters, a terrifying deterrent for any crew considering a voyage into territories controlled by rival merchant leagues. Similarly, the Arabian ghoul, a shape-shifting creature of the desert, served as a narrative guardian of lonely caravan routes, its story discouraging unlicensed traders from straying from established paths and encroaching on another group's economic turf. These were not random flights of fancy, they were calculated tools of risk management, using fear to protect commercial interests and maintain a fragile, unwritten order. Beyond geography, narrative enforced social boundaries. A haunting tale about a merchant struck by a mysterious illness after breaking a sacred trade pact was more than a ghost story. It was an informal legal system. In the absence of written contracts or universal law, these cautionary tales functioned as a powerful deterrent, regulating behavior across vast distances. They taught that trust was the most valuable currency of all, and that violating it could bring consequences not from a king's court, but from the cosmos itself. A story about a spirit that protected a sacred grove from over-harvesting was a way to ensure the sustainable management of a valuable resource, embedding an early form of environmental ethics within a memorable, supernatural framework. This reveals the dual nature of the storyteller's craft. The very same narrative power that could weave a Persian myth into a Roman tapestry could also erect invisible barriers, carefully delineating the safe from the dangerous, the permitted from the forbidden. These stories of the dark and unknown were not meant to paralyze with fear, but to guide with a firm hand, promoting cooperation and adherence to norms in a world where the only true constant was the endless, whispering flow of the story itself. The swoosh on a running shoe is more than a logo, it is the modern echo of a winged goddess. We no longer gather around a campfire to hear of heroic quests, but we do watch a 60-second film of an athlete overcoming immense hardship to cross a finish line. The psychological machinery is identical. Companies like Apple did not simply sell a personal computer, they narrated a rebellion against a monolithic establishment, casting every user as the hero in their own story of creative liberation. This is not a new marketing tactic, it is the direct descendant of the merchant bard reframing a common spice as a dragon's treasure. The archetypes are timeless. The wise mentor offering guidance is now a tech guru in a simple black turtleneck. The rebellious hero defying convention is the entrepreneur in a garage challenging entire industries. The magical object is no longer a sword from the gods, but a sleek device that promises to connect you to the entire world. These narratives tap into the same deep wells of meaning that the Epic of Gilgamesh once did, speaking to our innate desire for purpose, transformation, and belonging. The most powerful modern brands have built not just a customer base, but a community of believers, a tribe united by a shared story about who they are and what they value. This continuity reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology, that our brains are wired to make sense of the world through narrative. We do not just buy a product, we buy the better version of ourselves we see in its story. The ancient storytellers who walked the amber and silk routes were the original architects of this reality, mastering the art of weaving intangible value into tangible goods. Their legacy is not confined to history books, it is embedded in the very structure of our global economy, where the most valuable currency is still, and perhaps always will be, a compelling story. A Mesopotamian cylinder seal rests in the dust of the Indus Valley, thousands of miles from its origin. This small object is a silent witness, not just to the trade of goods, but to the conversations that must have happened between the people who carried it and the people who received it. When an archaeologist brushes the earth from such an artifact, they are uncovering a fragment of a shared story. The material proof for this exchange of myths is etched into stone and woven into fabric across the ancient world. In the region of Gandhara, along the Silk Road, artists created a breathtaking fusion of cultures. They sculpted the Buddha, but with the serene, idealized face of Apollo and the draped robes of a Greek philosopher. This Greco-Buddhist art is not a coincidence. It is the physical manifestation of a narrative collision, a moment when the spiritual story of enlightenment met the aesthetic story of classical beauty and created something entirely new. Similarly, a piece of Chinese silk might be embroidered with a phoenix, yet its feathers curl in a distinctly Persian style, showing how a mythical creature's legend traveled and evolved visually as it moved from one culture to the next. The distribution of these specific artistic styles acts as a map, tracing the flow of ideas just as clearly as any merchant's ledger. Inscriptions provide an even more direct voice from the past. The edicts of the Indian Emperor Ashoka, carved on pillars and rocks, have been found in locations as distant as modern Afghanistan and Egypt. These were not trade documents, they were philosophical proclamations, a ruler's personal narrative of remorse and commitment to non-violence, deliberately disseminated along the very trade routes that connected his empire to the wider world. He was using the infrastructure of commerce to broadcast a story about moral governance, proving that narratives of power and ethics were a core component of long-distance exchange. These artifacts, from seals to sculptures, move the entire conversation from intriguing theory to documented historical fact. They are the tangible proof that globalization is not a modern invention, but an ancient process, and that its most enduring cargo was not the silk that decayed or the spice that was consumed, but the stories that were adopted, adapted, and ultimately carved in stone for us to find. A Stoic philosopher and a Zoroastrian priest might have found common ground not in a royal court, but on a dusty roadside under a blanket of stars. Their conversation, fueled by the same journeys that moved silk and spices, carried a different kind of cargo entirely, the profound exchange of abstract thought. These were the philosopher storytellers, and their medium was the trade route itself. The legendary travels of Pythagoras illustrate this perfectly. He was not an isolated genius in Greece, but a voracious student of the world, said to have learned geometry from the Egyptians and astronomy from the Babylonians. His famous theorem, a cornerstone of rational inquiry, may well have been an idea that journeyed for centuries, refined in the great learning centers connected by commerce before it reached his ears. This was not theft, but intellectual cross-pollination on a continental scale. Later, the breathtakingly elegant concept of zero, developed in ancient India, began its own epic voyage. It traveled west with merchants and scholars into the Islamic world, where it was embraced and advanced by mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi, before finally crossing into medieval Europe. The very foundation of modern mathematics was passed along these narrative highways, hand to hand, culture to culture. But how do you make a concept like zero, the idea of nothingness, understandable to a wide audience? The answer lay in the power of the parable. Complex philosophical arguments about ethics or the nature of reality were often wrapped in the accessible cloak of a simple story. The famed fables of Aesop are a masterclass in this technique. A story about a tortoise and a hare is not really about animals. It is a lesson on the virtues of persistent effort over arrogant talent. A tale of a boy who cried wolf is a stark narrative about the decay of trust. These stories were the viral content of their day, packaging deep philosophical truths in a form so memorable and enjoyable that they effortlessly crossed every cultural and linguistic barrier they encountered. The trade routes, therefore, were far more than economic engines. They were the nervous system of the ancient world's intellect. They carried the seeds of skepticism, logic, and structured inquiry, allowing the philosophical traditions of Greece, India, Persia, and China to subtly influence one another, creating a rich, interconnected tapestry of human thought that would eventually shape the entire modern world. The vibrant Anatolian market was a world of its own, and at its heart were women who were far more than mere vendors. While their husbands and brothers might have been away on long caravan journeys, these women held the local economy together, and with it, the very soul of community narrative. They did not just sell textiles, they presented a tapestry of meaning, pointing to the intricate patterns and recounting the tales of the goddess who taught the first woman to weave, or the heroine whose courage was immortalized in the dye. These stories were their inheritance, passed from mother to daughter, a sacred trust as valuable as any currency. Their domain was the rich soil of folk knowledge, the practical wisdom of herbal remedies, the comforting tales of household spirits, and the unbroken line of matrilineal history that gave a family its identity. This localized storytelling was not separate from the grand legends carried by merchants. It was the source from which they often sprang. A traveler stopping at a market might hear a powerful local tale about a mountain spirit and then carry a version of that story 1,000 miles away, where it would eventually transform into something new. This process is perfectly captured in the enduring legend of the Queen of Sheba. Whether a historical monarch or a mythical archetype, her story of a powerful, knowledgeable queen journeying to test a king's wisdom traveled effortlessly along the incense routes. She became a narrative symbol of the intelligent, mobile woman, a figure whose legend was shaped and shared across cultures, from Ethiopia to Arabia and beyond. Her tale reminds us that women's influence on these circulating myths was profound, even if their physical travel was often limited. Recovering these layered voices does more than just correct the historical record. It fundamentally deepens our understanding of cultural exchange. It reveals that the great epics we know today were woven from countless threads, including the quiet, steady hum of women's stories shared over market stalls, at village wells, and within the home. This acknowledgement gives us a far richer, more complete picture of our shared mythological heritage, one where the loom was just as important as the ship. A shared story requires a shared tongue. In the cacophony of a bustling Mediterranean port, the first, halting words of a pidgin language were not born in a scholar's study, but in the urgent, hands-on chaos of the docks. A Greek merchant, a Phoenician sailor, and an Egyptian scribe with no common native language would have had to forge a basic, functional vocabulary on the spot, stripping away the complex grammar of their mother tongues to create a simple, direct means of exchange. This was the raw, practical origin of what would become a lingua franca, a bridge language that allowed not just for the trading of goods, but for the vital trading of narratives. When empires rose, they often institutionalized this process. Aramaic became the administrative language of the vast Persian Empire, its script traveling from royal decrees to the lips of merchants across the Near East. Similarly, the conquests of Alexander the Great spread Koine Greek, a common dialect, from Egypt to the borders of India, creating an unprecedented linguistic corridor. These languages did not remain pure. They were living, breathing entities that absorbed loanwords like sponges. The Greek word for ginger, a spice from the East, might have a Sanskrit root. An Aramaic term for a type of contract could be borrowed from Babylonian legal tradition, but more than just vocabulary was exchanged. The very rhythm and structure of storytelling began to blend. A Greek epic, with its focus on a single heroic individual, might slowly incorporate the repetitive, parallel structures common in Semitic poetry, creating a new hybrid narrative flow. The Lingua Franca itself was being sculpted by the kinds of tales it was required to carry. This reveals a beautiful, circular relationship. The human urge to share a story actively pushed language to evolve, to become more flexible and inclusive. Storytelling was not a passive user of a finished linguistic tool. It was one of the primary forces hammering that tool into shape on the anvil of human contact. The grammar of connection was written not by grammarians, but by merchants, sailors, and the countless unnamed storytellers who found that to make a stranger understand your deepest myths, you first had to learn how to ask for a cup of water, and in that simple request, begin building a new world of shared meaning. The camel's silhouette against the desert sun was a moving prayer for survival, but its true cargo was a library of myths. This creature was so much more than a beast of burden. It was a living legend, a partner believed to possess a direct line to the spirit world. Stories of its supernatural endurance were not mere exaggerations. They were vital psychological tools for the humans who shared its brutal journey. The two-humped Bactrian camel, the undisputed monarch of the Silk Road, was celebrated in song and story for its ability to find water where none seemed to exist, a skill so profound it was seen as a form of divine guidance. Similarly, the elegant dhows that sailed the Indian Ocean were not just wooden ships. They were characters in their own right, with sailors telling tales of how their very timbers held the memory of the sea, groaning with the secrets of past voyages. And on the vast Eurasian steppe, the horse was not merely transportation. It was an extension of the rider's own soul, its speed and loyalty woven into epic poems of conquest and kinship. These narratives did more than just honor essential partners. They transformed the terrifying reality of a long journey into a shared adventure with a trusted companion. The most fascinating fusion of observation and imagination might be the legendary griffin. This majestic creature, with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle, was said to be the fierce guardian of Scythian gold. Its origin likely lies not in pure fantasy, but in the accidental discoveries of Protoceratops dinosaur fossils eroding out of the Gobi desert cliffs. Ancient travelers encountering these beaked skulls and massive skeletal forms would have woven together the most powerful animals they knew, creating a mythical guardian that perfectly explained why the gold in those remote mountains was so hard to obtain. Every strange animal encountered on the road became a character in this ever-growing story. A merchant's account of a lumbering, single-horned beast in India might, after 1,000 retellings, become the unicorn of European legend. These myths were a way to process the incredible, to categorize the unknown by blending careful observation with a necessary sense of wonder. They were a testament to a deep, collaborative relationship between human and animal, where the story was the highest form of respect for the creatures that made the world feel smaller and a little less lonely. A merchant's hand was not just signing a contract, it was resting on a sacred stone that held the weight of an entire epic. Before the first caravan set out for the season, the community would gather for a ceremony that was as vital as any inventory check. An elder would rise to recite the founding story of their trade guild, perhaps the tale of a hero who first braved the desert wastes to bring back prosperity for all. This was not mere entertainment, it was a ritual that sanctified the journey ahead, weaving the practical act of commerce directly into the fabric of the cosmic order. The story itself became a binding force, reminding every merchant of their shared identity and the cultural obligations that came with it. An oath sworn on such a narrative carried immense power, linking a person's honor to the fate of legendary ancestors and placing their business dealings under the watchful eyes of the gods who witnessed those first mythical exchanges. Contracts were sealed not only with signatures but with invocations of divine witnesses, transforming a simple agreement between two people into a pact upheld by the entire spiritual realm. This ritualization provided a profound moral and ethical framework for trade. To act unfairly was not just a breach of a business deal, it was an affront to the story that defined their people. A successful voyage was celebrated with a performance of the very myths that had blessed their endeavor, completing a cycle where narrative, spirituality, and economics became inseparable. This practice reveals a worldview where the economy was never a separate, secular sphere. It was an expression of community values, a sacred dance guided by the timeless rhythm of the stories they held dear. In such a world, every transaction was a reaffirmation of faith, and every trade route was a path walked not just by merchants, but by the legends that gave their journey meaning. The great caravan cities grew quiet, their wells slowly filling with sand. A network that had pulsed with life for centuries was falling into a profound silence, severed by shifting political winds and the new, alluring promise of the sea. But the stories, those resilient travelers, did not vanish with the last merchant. They simply stopped their endless journey, a tale that had been reshaped with every telling, from the banks of the Indus to the shores of the Mediterranean, was suddenly set adrift from the current that had given it life. It was at this moment of stillness that these fluid narratives began to crystallize, transforming from living traditions into the sacred texts and national epics we recognize today. The once countless variations of the Ramayana, which had adapted to local forests and heroes across Southeast Asia, were now being meticulously written down by scribes, their preferred version declared the definitive one. The Epic of Odysseus, a collection of sailors' yarns that changed with every port, was codified into a single, authoritative poem. This was a necessary act of preservation, a fortress built against the erosion of time, but it came with a profound cultural cost. The very act of writing a story down, of fixing it on parchment or palm leaf, stripped it of its inherent dynamism. A local tale about a mountain spirit that once belonged to every storyteller who voiced it was now the property of a text, its words immutable. The vibrant, often contradictory, diversity of the oral tradition was smoothed into a single, sanctioned storyline. The playful trickster god known in one village might be forever locked as a solemn figure in another, simply because one version made it into the holy book while another did not. This transition from the flexible word spoken aloud to the permanent word written down marks one of the most pivotal shifts in human history. It allowed these magnificent stories to survive the collapse of empires, but it also froze them in time, creating a canonical myth that could now be defended, disputed, and even weaponized, for its authority was no longer in its ability to adapt, but in its claim to a singular, unchanging truth. The living river of narrative had been channeled into a deep, still reservoir, preserving its waters but losing the current that once carried it to new and unexpected lands. Our digital world hums with the same ancient energy that once animated the Silk Road. The Internet is its direct descendant, a vast electronic network where data packets have replaced camel caravans. Instead of merchant bards and pilgrim scribes, we now have content creators and social media influencers, their stories carried not on foot but at the speed of light. The principles of narrative exchange remain unchanged. A viral dance challenge originating in Seoul is not simply copied in Sao Paulo. It is creatively remixed with local music and style, becoming a new hybrid expression within hours. This is the global folklore of our time, a constantly evolving tapestry of memes and trends that functions just like the ancient myths that traveled from oasis to oasis. The digital algorithm is the new market square, a powerful, invisible force that determines which stories are seen and which fade into obscurity, shaping our collective consciousness with every click and share. Understanding how a story from India could transform on its way to Rome gives us a powerful lens to analyze modern media and the rapid spread of information and sometimes misinformation. It reveals that the human need to adapt a narrative to localize its meaning for a new audience is a timeless constant. Our identities are now forged in these virtual spaces around shared digital stories that create a sense of belonging across vast physical distances. We are still using the same psychological tools as our ancestors, navigating a world of overwhelming complexity by telling each other stories. The only difference is that our caravans are now made of fiber optic cable, and our communal campfires glow with the light of a billion screens. Our journey through time reveals a simple, enduring truth, that human connection has always flowed through the stories we share. The ancient storytellers who walked with merchants and pilgrims were far more than entertainers. They were the original architects of global understanding. With every tale whispered at a desert oasis or sung in a bustling port, they wove a cultural fabric so strong it could bind distant civilizations into a single, shared human experience. Their legacy shows us that commerce and creativity were never opposing forces, but essential partners in our collective progress. The drive for material exchange and the yearning for meaningful narrative have always traveled hand in hand, each giving the other purpose and depth. By remembering their craft, we gain a new lens to view our own world, to see the invisible stories traveling with every product we buy and every piece of media we consume. It invites us to become more mindful, to ask what legends are being woven along the digital trade routes of our own era. What new myths are taking shape in the global network, and what timeless human truths do they carry forward? This exploration is merely a beginning. We would love to hear which ancient trade route story resonated most with you, so share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this adventure into the myths that made us, subscribe for more journeys through the tales that connect us all.